So now we're going to talk about, we start off by saying that trademarks were one of the core assets of your business. Another is the trade secret. So this would include such things as, if you're in a restaurant business, if the restaurant's in the room, it's your recipes, it may be your methods of operation. We have a lot of service-based concepts in the room, so those are going to be how you do what you do in your business processes and your marketing and so forth, right? So these are all trade secrets, or we think they're trade secrets. But in order for them to remain a trade secret, we need to protect them. So North Carolina, like many states, has adopted the Uniform Trade Secret Act. So a trade secret is a technical term defined under the Act. It must derive independent commercial value from not being generally known or readily accessible to others. So an example would be the Coca-Cola formula, right? That would be perhaps the biggest trade secret in the world. That it only has value because they know how to make it and nobody else does. And is subject to reasonable efforts to maintain its scrutiny. Now, not everyone's going to keep it under lock and key like Coca-Cola does, and only a handful of people know the recipe or have access to it. But you need to take reasonable efforts to protect that. Most often, that's going to be, in the case of you and franchising, is going to be through your franchise agreement, where you're going to have a license to them to use your confidential, non-public information, and they're only able to do it under the terms of the franchise agreement. But what do we do during other phases of the franchise relationship, specifically, as we were talking about earlier in the day, with prospective franchisees? Your FDD is clearly not a trade secret, right? Because particularly if you're registered in franchise registration states, it may be on the public record where people can download it. Perhaps it may be a trade secret if you're not in any of those states, if you have them sign an NDA, right? So you can require them to sign an NDA as part of that development process. They can't have a non-compete as part of that, but they can't use it as. Some franchisors do that, some don't. Now, in the case of Smash My Trash, it didn't work out very well for them. They had this NDA. The Franchise Fastlane was their franchise outsource organization that they were working with. They had them sign the NDA. Then they proceeded to have a series of calls with franchisees. They had a founders call where the founders were talking about the business. So these were conference calls Zoom calls that people could attend. They had what they called a franchisee forum. I don't know what that is. I assume that was a group of franchisees. We'll ignore whether that was even legal to do by cherry-picking the franchisees to be on the call. But for purpose of discussion, I'm not going to get into that. But they had them on the call, and of course they were saying whatever they wanted to say about their experience of being franchisees. Well, this one enterprising young man decides shortly after applying, well, I'm going to get with my friend who, believe it or not, I'm not making this up, the name of his friend's concept was Dumpster Devils. So he gets with Dumpster Devils and says, well, I'm going to secret shop, being the devil that they are, I'm going to secret shop the Smash My Trash and find out their information so I can help Dumpster Devils become more effective in what they do. So this guy goes through the franchise sales process. He signs the NDA. They have these calls. The way that Franchise Fastlane tried to validate that this was a serious prospect was that, I guess, to attend these calls, you had to buy a plane ticket to come to Discovery Day, to come to the franchise headquarters, figuring that nobody would do that if they weren't serious. Well, this guy bought the ticket and he scanned a copy of it to the salesperson, and then a couple of days before he's supposed to go, calls in and says, my dog is sick. thought it was the lamest excuse ever. But that was the excuse, and apparently they bought it, so he continued to sit through these calls instead of being tipped off that the dog being sick was probably not a good reason to not come to the discovery day. And so anyway, he's building out his alternate universe, and even getting down to having Google AdWorks that were using the trademark of the competitor and saying, no franchise fee, we're better than they are, so forth. So in the end, the court did not grant them a preliminary injunction. So a preliminary injunction would be at the beginning of a case where basically they were trying to stop them from using this information, and it's a fairly high standard. So that doesn't mean they didn't prevail on the merits, but they didn't get the injunction because the court couldn't find that they had a substantial likelihood that they would prevail, that Smash My Trash would prevail, that they would grant the preliminary injunction. And part was that the franchisor admits in their testimony that none of the stuff that they were claiming was confidential was actually a trade secret, which was a surprising admission that they made, because they were getting into cost of opening, how the trucks worked, all of these kind of the dumpsters. I guess they're not trucks; they're sort of dumpsters in trucks, but how that all worked. So again, if you want to make sure that you are providing information in your franchise sales process, you have to provide enough information so that people will want to move forward. But if you're going to give an open book before they have paid the franchise fee and signed the agreement, people are going to be willing to continue to take that from you. At some point, you need to call the question and say, no, the rest of that, if you want that, you need to sign the franchise agreement. That's what you're signing the license to get, and it wouldn't be fair to us or to our other franchisees to key you in on that before the franchise sale occurs. And in this situation, I shouldn't maybe even use their name, but but if you're just selling franchises, in the case with an outsourced franchise organization, they're not having to deal with that issue post-closing. And so that's something to think about as far as making sure when you're working with them, if you are working with outsourced franchise people, salespeople, to understand how much you're willing to tell in that kind of presentation, and make sure there's some constraints on it to avoid putting out more information that you will then regret it later. Now, another thing that we suggest is to consider having validation passwords. This helps with a couple of things, because your list of franchisees is in your franchise disclosure document, right? So if you're a fast-growing system or you're generating a lot of leads, as Emmy was talking about earlier, franchisees are very generous, generally speaking, with their time, but it can become annoying if they can't focus on their business because so many people are calling them. So what you can legally do is say, okay, we're gonna, our password is guacamole or whatever it's going to be in our system, so that we know that that person is far enough in the process that we're encouraging them, farther along in the process that we're encouraging them to contact people to validate at this time, and then they might feel more free to talk with those folks. So you can control, to some degree, the timing of when that occurs, both through when you just provide them with a copy of the FDD, as well as with that kind of the password thing, so that you know that those people are actually legitimate prospects and aren't just the guy down the street who's trying to secret shop your brand. So during a franchise relationship, you want to make sure that each of your owners of the franchise are also bound by the confidentiality agreement, that you haven't just entered into the franchise agreement with their corporation and you, by extension, don't have a confidentiality agreement with the actual ownership group. Well, now, what agreements can franchisee employees sign? We do not recommend, for a variety of reasons I'll cover later in the presentation, specifying a form of confidentiality agreement for the franchisee's employees to sign. Now, you can require the franchisee to treat all of the information as confidential and trade secret, and only allow it to be shared with those on a need-to-know basis and they should have adequate agreements between themselves, but that you aren't mandating the form of that agreement, because we don't want, for reasons I'll talk about later. I don't steal my own thunder. Are disclosures to employees limited to what is necessary to fulfill their job roles? So everyone doesn't need to have access to every provision in your brand standards manual. And with modern technology, it's very easy to segment that. If the online portal that you're using, you could have different credentials for different parts of the manual. And your franchisees will support you in this, or they should, because they don't necessarily want the shift manager knowing how the profitability model for the system works and so forth. Not only do you not want them to do that, they don't necessarily want that to happen either. Now, we use the word operations manual here, but really I prefer the word brand standards manual, because, again, what we're mandating and what we're going to potentially terminate people for are violations of brand standards. So brand standards manuals or operations manuals, I always say, if you're from North Carolina, you'll understand this, that they're like kudzu, right? And kudzu, they just sort of grow, right? And they sort of grow, and next thing you know, you've got 600 pages in your brand standards manual. Well, if those aren't things, as Emmy noted earlier, that you're willing to terminate someone for, maybe you need to have 2 manuals or 3. We already said that we need a manual for how the logo is being used, and that we need the brand standards manual that is our measuring stick that the franchise agreement is going to reference, that says you need to operate in accordance with the terms of this franchise agreement and the then current version of the brand standards manual that allows us to adapt and grow over time. And then there's the manual of good suggestions, right? And so things that aren't in that category go in the manual of good suggestions. There are things to know that's part of the tribal knowledge of the system, but everything just doesn't go automatically into the brand standards manual. Because that becomes important as we talk a little bit later about joint employer, among other things, and it also becomes important just because we don't want to be having to enforce standards against a franchisee who's not following them, and that franchisee she's going to point to 5 instances where we didn't enforce our manual against someone else, and so they didn't think that the manual was important. And then lastly, about who accesses calls at if you have a franchise convention. Many brands have an annual convention. Who's invited to that convention? What materials are being distributed? Are spouses, for example, invited to the business sessions if they're not subject to the confidentiality agreement where you're talking about the next new product line that you're going to launch? Either you need to get spouses signed up on the front end, or if it's important that they be able to attend, or then you need to exclude it to the people with whom you have a confidentiality agreement. So during the franchise relationship, is there notice that the information is confidential? So it's very easy to watermark and so forth items to make clear that it's confidential. You can use technology to help limit access. This is what a franchise nerd I am, right? When I go into Golden Corral and I see their little screen behind the buffet that I assume has recipes and so forth on it, right, of how to put things together, right? So they've got that controlled, so that allows a couple of things. One is nobody's walking out with it on a flash drive or with copies, and also that if they update the recipe and change it, it can be seamlessly updated throughout the system. And you want franchisees to be trained on what is confidential information and have them train their employees. So that's one of the key takeaways we want you to have from today's presentation, is that we're not training the franchisees' employees, we're training the franchisees on how to train their employees, and we need to communicate to them what needs to be communicated to their employees. And then controlling data. So, one of the most important, if not the most important part of your business as you grow is going to be your customer data. That data allows you to know who your customers are, know how much they spend with you, know who to be talking to, who to be spending your marketing resources on. So that information, everyone is trying to capture it and use it. But also, as Lance noted, the bad guys are trying to get in at your data. And Carly's going to talk a little bit later about that and what you need to be doing. What about departing employees or franchisees' employees? What actual controls do you have to control ongoing access? So the recipe book was a good example. In the case of your corporate employees, are you doing some kind of exit interview and having an opportunity for them to return or certify that they've returned all confidential information? And then are you doing any kind of follow-up with people after they've been terminated, make sure that that has actually occurred?